Okay, so in 1857, Kansas wants to come in and wants their statehood, right? And according to Kansas-Nebraska Act, Kansas should be able to decide via popular sovereignty. But the problem is that when Kansas goes as a territory, you have to submit your territorial government to the federal level, right? And the federal government then either approves of your territorial constitution based on whether or not there's anything in there that would be unconstitutional at the federal level, because remember, federal law is the supreme law of the land, right? Okay? So, as a result of that, they have to submit to get approval for theirs, okay? And so they actually wind up submitting two. They do submit the Lecompton Constitution, which is the slavery one, and the Lawrence, which is the anti-slavery. Does that help the yay? Yeah, that trick? Okay, good. So you have these two separate ones, right, that are both kind of submitted. But the problem is which one is actually more largely supported by the people living in Kansas and the residents of Kansas. But the key problem here is, how do we tell citizenship of a state in 1857?
Population.
Are you there? Does that make sense? Like, there's no, like, driver's license. There's no way to, like, affirm your citizenship or your residency of that state. Does that make sense? Yes?
So would they just go around and count everyone?
Kind of, yes. Okay? A lot of it is based on estimation of the numbers of people within the particular area. Does that make sense? But the problem also means that if I actually live in Missouri, I can go into Kansas on the day that they're voting and vote, even though I'm not an actual resident of Kansas. Does that make sense? Today, if you want to vote in a North Dakota thing, right, something's going on and you want to go vote, what do you have to bring with you to prove residency? You can bring your driver's license, your North Dakota driver's license, or
Other government issued documentary.
or not birth certificate, because that only shows where you were born, not where you reside. Mail, a piece of mail. Does that make sense? That's what it is. So North Dakota is actually really, really easy to go and vote, because you really don't even need a driver's license or a state-issued ID. All you need is a piece of mail to prove that you live in the area in which you're voting.
Entertainment Weekly.
Okay? Yeah, so I mean, it's actually...
They live up here in the summer and they live down there in the winter. So
Yeah.
like, well, I got my North Dakota mail.
Yeah.
And then in Texas, I think they're probably a little more strict because they don't want illegals voting.
Yeah, and North Dakota is really easy compared to a lot of states. North Dakota is very easy to be able to go and vote, okay? So there's really no barriers for voting here in the state of North Dakota. But so the problem then becomes is which one is actually, if we're doing this based on popular sovereignty, which one is actually the will of the people of Kansas versus what is the will of somebody else moving in or coming in? And ultimately, the reality of what happens is the Free Soilers basically, they had to vote against slavery to prevent it from happening, whereas the pro-slavers just had to get theirs, like, enough, like, people to be like, okay, well, I don't really care really against slavery. Like, I personally am not going to own slaves, but if you own slaves, I don't really care if you own slaves. Does that make sense? So it's a little bit, the level of needing to accomplish something is greater from the Lawrence people, the anti-slavery, than the pro-slavery individuals, okay? And ultimately, what happens is Buchanan actually, as a Southern sympathizer and a man also who owned slaves, Buchanan actually admits Kansas to the Union as a slave state. Douglas then and his followers argue that the Lecompton Constitution is not democratically garnered because the people that voted for the Lecompton Constitution were actually not residents of Kansas. So even though Buchanan admits them as a state under slavery, Douglas is like, I'm not going to do this. I want you to go to another vote. And as at the time he was the pro tem of the Senate. Okay, so basically he's running and leading the Senate. He basically says you need to go back, get a secondary vote to prove that this is what the people really want, and then Congress will sign off on it. Okay, because ultimately it's not Buchanan's job to sign off on it, it's Congress's job to sign off on it. Does that make sense? So they are the ones who actually have to approve it. So despite the fact that it goes then back to Kansas, it's put to a new vote in 1858. In 1858, now the Kansas voters vote against slavery. So now here we have a pro-slavery and an anti-slavery. Which one is actually legitimate, right? And what happens is basically, despite the fact that we have two different constitutions, one that technically is kind of approved by the president, so therefore maybe the other one is invalid, we don't really have a firm decision when it comes to Kansas. Does that make sense? So Kansas is kind of just left to just, well, Kansas, we'll come back to this situation. But unfortunately, it's 1858, which means it's also a midterm year, election year, and we are also getting very close to the Civil War and the 1860 election. So we never get back to dealing with what to do with Kansas. Does that make sense? So ultimately, Kansas will become and come into the Union, but they will enter into the Union in 1861 under Lincoln as a free state. Okay? So it's not really dealt with. In addition to all the issues over slavery, there's other issues within our country. Remember, there's never any singular thing. We've also already talked about the anti-immigrant sentiment that's growing within the United States. Not that it didn't exist before, because it's always existed, but it's just growing against the Irish and the Germans. But in addition to that, our economy of the 1850s only creates further divide between the North and the South. Okay? When we look at this, again, the North becomes increasingly industrial as per the first industrial revolution, and we're becoming more and more industrialized. We are going to see greater and greater infrastructure built in the North, including railroads, to where by the end of the 1850s, the vast majority of the North is interconnected via rail line. In the South, however, we don't see this interconnection via rail line. In fact, we actually see that there's only a very few rail lines. One runs east-west, and then there are two that run north-south. That's it, really, in the South. And also, the North and the South, we can see even the division in the rail lines because they weren't even the same size. So literally, you could not take a train that was running on tracks in the South and then take it to the North, because the tracks in the South were actually larger than the tracks in the North. And so a train with this larger wheel, right, because if you've ever seen a train wheel, it's grooved, right, or you played with trains when you were little, right? Yeah, right, there's a little groove in the wheel of the train, and that's what helps it sit on top of the track. Well, in the South, these were wider, and in the North, they were narrower. So a train from the South, if it were to travel to the North, it would actually derail and come off of the tracks. And a train from the North trying to come into the South couldn't, because the rail was not big or was too big for the wheels of the northern trains.
Was there a certain reason for that?
Just division between the two of them and non-cooperation between the two as to designing the infrastructure. Does that make sense?
They tried to pitch it hey, let's just make one standard thing.
Well, yeah, that would totally have made sense, but no, it just doesn't work like that. Well, we see under the American system, this idea that we need this internal improvements throughout the United States and to have this uniformity, but most Southerners were against the American system in large part because of the tariffs as part of the Bank of the United States, internal improvements and tariffs, because those tariffs, while they protected northern industry, they hurt southern plantation economy. Does that make sense? So that causes a lot of that division and thus leads the South to kind of create their own difference. Yes?
So is there not a lot of communication between them when they're making these?
I mean, there is, but there's just, well, we have our way of doing things and you have your way of doing things, and we can't it just shows you that we can't come to an agreement on how to do something as simple as, like, railroads. Like, that, you think of anything would make sense to just be like, yeah, let's have like one uniform style, but it shows the division of our country. Does that make sense? And that's really why I highlight that. It's not something you need to really remember, but I highlight it to show you how divided we were actually by this point, okay? And so as we continue to see the change in growth in like interchangeable parts and producing more and more products, the northern United States will also begin to see a greater emphasis on education. Because if you educate the industrial worker, it's easier to train the industrial worker. You don't have to be like, okay, let me show you how to do this, and then I'm going to show you how to do this. Instead, you can just be like, here, read this. Figure it out. Does that make sense? And so that education is actually something that in a factory system at this point is actually really useful. Not later, but right now it is. So we're going to see greater education in those northern areas. In addition to that, because of the fact that we're in a city atmosphere, it makes a lot more sense to educate people in mass rather than educate people in smaller numbers. In the South, because the plantations are so large, and really the only people that you need to educate are the white plantation owners' children, you had no need for an area schoolhouse. Instead, they would hire tutors to come to their homes and educate their children. Does that make sense? There's no need to educate all of them or to have these large schoolhouses. So unfortunately, the white, poor yeoman farmer continued to remain uneducated, and largely most of the poor white yeomans of the southern region were also unable to read or write, much the same as African Americans could not read and or write in the South. Okay? What's that?
Unless you're Douglas.
Well, yeah, but there's a rare instance of a plantation owner and the wife of the plantation owner taking enough interest in an individual to actually educate them. And we saw within that narrative that her husband said, yeah, he did not approve it. He said, don't do that, right? This is not okay to educate these individuals. The South, on the other hand, becomes increasingly reliant on cotton. The South, despite individuals, like we had talked about previously, we talked about